All right, so we left off from our part one with the Germans' creation of Lufthansa to train their pilots, build their aircraft, and work on the logistics that you'll need for defending your country and also fighting in a war. Also, the ways they got around the Treaty of Versailles. One thing that was not covered by the Treaty of Versailles were rockets and space science. The picture there you see is of the V2 rocket, which they came up with for World War II. The Treaty of Versailles dealt with what you could see, and it was active during World War I. It did not take into account future weapons that could be developed. A lot of the weapons they came up with would be the foundations for the German military in the future. By the time Hitler came to power, most of these things were already in place. So everything was in place 5 to 7 years after Versailles and also before Hitler took power. Also during the interwar years is the rise of the Empire of Japan. So Japan had been on the rise since the 1890s, since they were opened by the Americans in the late 1850s. They had figured out, instead of being carved up like China, they would be able to stand by themselves. They defeat the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War that was fought from 1904 to 1905. They are feeling resentful because the United States and Great Britain are preventing them from creating standardization in Asia and the Western Pacific, basically creating their own empire that they would rule in Asia and the Western Pacific. The Japanese, to expand their empire, Japan is much like England. Well, England had some abilities for production, but Japan was a very not resource rich, but resource poor country. So they needed to go places where there was resources. One of these places was Manchuria. They invade Manchuria in 1931. That is condemned by the League of Nations, but the League of Nations can't do anything about it. It's basically kind of useless when it comes to this. It was created to basically fight or stop warfare like this, but unfortunately, without the backing of the United States, it didn't really work. So it was condemned in the League of Nations, but they really can't do anything about it. Fighting a war costs money, but Japan really doesn't have that much money. When the Great Depression comes, it really hits the island of Japan, the Empire of Japan, very hard. So the army has to figure out how to pay for itself, so it gets involved in the trade of opium. Basically, in order to pay for their fighting their wars, they become drug runners. The Soviet Union is created in the 20s. They had a general fear of the West. This is basically capitalism versus communism. They were afraid of the capitalists coming to stop their revolution. So in 1918, after the Tsar is overthrown or forced to abdicate and the war is over, the Allies actually invade Russia. They land on the Pacific side of Russia and take over some cities and basically kind of set up camp there and back the White Russians. The White Russians are the Tsarists. They back the imperial family and the idea of the imperial power. Basically, with them being stuck on the other side of Russia, they don't really go anywhere, but that did scare the Russians, the Soviets, that they would always be picked on by the West. The West was always afraid of them. Or they were always afraid of the West. Stalin, who rose to the ranks after Lenin died, would not allow any opposition. One of the leaders of the Bolshevik Revolution was also Leon Trotsky, and Stalin was able to run him out of Russia in 1929. Stalin was a very paranoid person. Usually you get that in dictators. So he was always afraid of losing power. So one of the things he did, what he was afraid of, was that the military would overthrow him and remove him from power. So basically, to make sure that this doesn't happen, is that he removes any of the anti-revolutionaries, so people that were against the Bolshevik Revolution, and the followers of Trotsky. And basically, he really does a number on the Soviet military. So the purges that took place in 1937-1938. Stalin executed 3 out of 5 Soviet field marshals. Field marshals are basically our equivalent to generals of the army. So 3 out of 5 Eisenhowers were killed. 14 of 16 generals executed. All full admirals. So decimates the Soviet Navy. He had the half of the entire officer corps shot or imprisoned. More officers were killed in 1 year during this purge than any other army had lost in any war in human history. Basically, the purges did more damage to the Soviet military than Hitler ever could. And Stalin wanted to make sure he had yes men, not people that would tell him no, because he didn't want that. So basically, he wanted people that were loyal to him, not people who were basically brilliant being leaders in the military. Also, during this time, you have another rise of a fascist leader in Spain. That would be the Spanish Civil War, which was a fight between Francisco Franco, who was the Republican, and the loyalists or the royalists who backed the King of Spain. Franco was, like we said, a fascist, so Germany and Italy backed Franco. And this is in the middle 30s, so about 1936. Hitler comes to power in 33. So now that he has all of this military in place, or at least what he thinks is in place, now he can try it out. So basically, Spain becomes a laboratory for the German military. What he does is he sends a group of men called the Condor Legion to get experience in warfare. This is where they send a lot of their planes that they built. They send them to Spain to try them out to see how they work. Most of these planes that they were built were now, instead of biplanes like the First World War, were single engine planes with more powerful engines and were all metal, and they were much faster than the old biplanes. Biplanes back then were built of wood and canvas, so now you have full metal planes that can go faster and maneuver better. Basically, this training helps make the German Air Force more successful, the Luftwaffe. Also, during the Spanish-American War, they're able to train their pilots for all weather conditions. In fact, during the Spanish Civil War, the Germans that were fighting for Franco actually lost more pilots they did in bad weather and fighting. Also, this is where the Germans take what they've learned from creating an airline and flying mail across Germany. They take what they've learned in air operations and put them to work in the Spanish Civil War. This is a painting of Guernica by Pablo Picasso. It was painted in 1937. Basically, Guernica was one of the first what you would call terror bombings. There was absolutely no military reason to bomb Guernica, but the Spanish Air Force, backed by the Condor Legion, bombed it and bombed civilians. It turned out to be a very bad thing, but it was a good way to make the people fear the leadership. Also, during the Spanish Civil War, I keep calling it the Spanish-American War, Spanish Civil War, Americans volunteered to fight for the left. There was a bunch of different factions, and a lot of these were considered communists. One of these American brigades was known as the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, and they went over there to fight the fascists. The government didn't send them. These were all volunteers. Much in the same way that we'll find out as we talk about World War II, how the Americans helped the British in World War II. You have the American Eagle Squadron that flies during the Battle of Britain, and you have the Flying Tigers in China that fly for Nationalist China fighting the Japanese. The Spanish Civil War, over 600,000 people die. 100,000 of them are killed from torture and execution. Half die of disease and famine. And Franco is victorious in this war and actually remains in power longer than any of his other friends that were fascists. He remains in power until he died in 1975, where he cut a deal when he died that all of Spain would return back to royal control. So the United States at this time were trying to figure out a lot of different things. So one thing they were trying to figure out, a young officer named Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1919 was training soldiers for the war, so he actually didn't get to get over there. But he did sign on for a group to experiment with this new transportation thing called a truck. Now, we had cars and trucks were used in World War I, but this was really a huge way of learning if these trucks could be used in war and move stuff and supplies like they need to. So Eisenhower takes on a transcontinental voyage across the United States. Basically, it proves that the American roads really, really suck. But it also shows that mechanization is very important. So it's a lot easier to get stuff to the front with trucks rather than horses and wagons. It's also during this time that you have the services battling for money. We're in the Depression. So the services are fighting for funds to keep going. So you have admirals fighting for battleships, the new weapon called the aircraft carrier, and submarines. The Army generals are fighting over mechanizing their forces, infantry, and cavalry, and also the new idea of an air corps, basically airplanes. The New Deal comes up how to build a lot of this stuff. A lot of the public works help to modernize American production for military hardware. You had the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, creating hydroelectric dams. In order to make planes out of metal, you have to be able to convert it. It takes a lot of power to convert, to create this metal that is very light that they use called aluminum. So it requires a lot of electricity. So the New Deal helps create a lot of these dams that help create the aluminum that will be put onto the aircraft that will fight in this future war that everyone is preparing for but isn't really sure when it's going to start. So with that, we're going to stop here and we are going to get into the Great Depression and what it was doing here in the United States. We will start with that, with Franklin Delano Roosevelt being elected president in 1932. So we're going to stop it here, and I will see you in the next segment here of Session 3.